If you open your Bibles to Acts chapter 17, we've only got a few more lessons in this series. Convincing others they need to change. Acts chapter 17. The key word we're going to look at today is acknowledge. They need to be acknowledged as people who have value, have worth, their pursuits and their efforts and the common ground that we have with them. Acts 17, as I have been trying to do the last several weeks, I want to begin with the end. And so we'll look at verses 32 through 34 to find the climax of our story. Verse 32, Acts 17, now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. But others said, we'll hear you again about this. So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed. Among them was Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. And so we see that there was results that came about this day. Last year, my son was blessed to go on a mission trip to Greece, and while Gabriel was in Greece, they visited Athens. And while he was in Athens, he took time to read the sermon that Paul presented to the Areopagus. And so I got a picture of that, and I'll treasure that the rest of my life. I'm sure that Gabriel was able to do something I've never done. Dad, when I was very young, he took us to the Holy Lands, and we were able to view Jerusalem and even parts of Jordan. But I've never been to Greece, never been able to stand in this particular spot like my son did, but I think that would be a powerful moment. That being said, you see that the results are not as profound as we've found in other places. You got some who are just simply outright mocking the idea of the resurrection from the dead. As you know, there were many folks back in the day, Sadducees included, who did not believe that there was a resurrection from the dead. And once you're dead, you're like Rover, you're dead all over and it's done. And that just kind of completed the cycle for you. However, Jesus, as he comes on the scene, he not only gives us hope in this life, but he most certainly gives us hope in the next. And so the resurrection is not just central to Christianity, it's absolutely foundational. That we've got to believe in the resurrection. So Paul, when he goes in amongst these, what we would call pagans, idolaters, individuals who were enamored by a plethora of gods, he is not shy about speaking the truth. And even though this is going to bring him a great deal of mockery, he sticks to the script. He's going to speak what is accurate, and he's going to talk about a Jesus who brought about the resurrection. So there are going to be those who are mocking, and then there's going to be those who say, that's interesting. Yeah, you can come back again. We'd like to hear some more. And then you're going to have the third group, which is really the climax here. You've got some men who joined and believed, and then he names some individuals that are part of that group. That, of course, gives us the reason to pedal backwards now and ask ourselves, well, what led to this? Why were a few of them convinced that they needed to change their life, that they needed to accept this Jesus that Paul is talking about? And so now I want you to pedal backwards, if you will, to verse 22, and I'll give you my first point with regard to acknowledgement. Paul, in the last week and this week, Paul provides what are probably some of the most practical steps that we can take with regards to convincing others. Last week's very powerful with the chapter 16, Paul and Silas back into probably a cave, a prison cell, and they're singing and praying at midnight. Very impressed by that, the jailer was, and therefore he decides to give his life, and he and his entire family, and there we have the first home church established right there in Philippi. Well, when you move then to chapter 17, Paul has moved on beyond Philippi now, and he's down into the heart of Greece, and as he is now in the epicenter of paganism, really, even at this particular point, Rome would of course been the capital of the world, but even at this point, Rome still succumbed to much of the image that Greece, Athens specifically, presented to the world with regards to all the various gods that they had. And so Paul now goes into this place that's just given over to idolatry. And what you're going to find in verse 22 is that he's going to acknowledge their pursuit. Let's read verse 22 and you'll see the point, I think, pretty plainly on your page. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. Scholars are divided as to whether or not that statement is intended to be a compliment. Many believe that it is. I've walked among you and I've noticed that you're very religious people. Now, he's not in that trying to validate their religions, but he is saying, I appreciate the fact that you're pursuing a degree of reaching out to God or gods. Other scholars believe that this actually was more of a statement designed to peg them for being superstitious, and that their superstitions had overwhelmed them. And that Paul wasn't so much trying to compliment them as he was saying to them that I see that you're given over to a lot of passions with regards to superstition. I don't know. They don't know. I suspect you don't know either. But I think there is one thing that we can gather from this statement that I see that you're very religious. I think that we can gather, number one, that Paul at least acknowledges they are pursuing something beyond themselves. The application I'd like to draw for you with regards to convincing others that they need to change is that when we go into a context such as this, one of the things that's very important is for us to look for any good that we can find. Is there something I can relate to this person on? And, it may be as strange as I appreciate your hairdo. You got a nice pair of pants. You may not be able to find anything else, but if you can at least establish some level of acknowledgement that you're pursuing something worthwhile, as Paul seems to be making that acknowledgement here. When we go into our communities and we see the number of denominations that we have within Christendom, we get alarmed, and as we should. But that doesn't mean that there isn't common ground that we could start with at the very least. However, I think you're acknowledging, as I am, that our world, our community is changing radically. Over the last decade or so, we have seen individuals that have moved into our community that are not like our particular cultural background. Individuals who perhaps wears clothing that is not like our religious background. Individuals who we pass by them and we question. I wonder what religion they're even a part of. We're finding that the world is becoming a much smaller place. And as it becomes a much smaller place, we're finding a diversity of people who are cramming in themselves into various, even as small as our little community here. And we find a challenge, I think, at least I do, you find it challenging to find that common ground, to find that place that you and I can relate. Let's start off with something positive, and sometimes it's very difficult to find that. But Paul, as he goes into, and I think that you would have to agree, that he's going into, in this setting, a much more diverse context than you and I have ever experienced. And yet Paul is able to go here and acknowledge at least you're pursuing something bigger than yourself. That may be as far as you can go with somebody. The Muslim and the headdress and the various prayers that they offer throughout the day and the various standards that they like to put upon you and I with regards to cultural changes, those kind of things. You might say to yourself, that's hard for me to have any level of relationship with that, but you should, you can. These are individuals who were created just as you were created. These are individuals who pursue something bigger than themselves, just as you pursue something bigger than yourself. We do not worship the same God. Their Allah is not our Jehovah. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But the fact of the matter is that they do, to some degree, try to find something bigger than themselves to pursue. And so I think that if we were to put ourselves in Paul's position, or maybe vice versa, if Paul were to put himself in our position, he would find common ground with even that religious group. And we ought to as well. Not to in any way validate it, but to recognize that it's very important for us to start off with some level of common footing. As you continue reading then in verse 23, you're going to find that it's not just he acknowledges their pursuit in general, but he's going to acknowledge their efforts in that pursuit. Verse 23, for as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. So Paul, as he's walking among the people, as he's walking downtown, as he's walking in the city, he comes across that altar that you've heard many sermons preached about, to the unknown God. And Paul is going to go beyond just saying, okay, I acknowledge your pursuit. Now he's going to say, I acknowledge the fact that you're making efforts in your pursuit. That I think Paul would say is a little over the top. You've gone way afield of things that are appropriate, but yet you're making an effort. Again, you know the background to the altar to the unknown God. They were so steeped in idolatry. And the numerous gods, read Greek mythology, and the number of gods and demigods are just endless. But they were so steeped in these beliefs that they had altars to everything and every god that they could possibly come up with. And then, just in case we miss one, we'll have the altar to the unknown God. And so Paul, he makes an effort to acknowledge the fact that this altar is a result of a somewhat positive pursuit on your part to look beyond yourself. They look to the sun and they create a god to the sun. They look to the moon, a god, the stars, the grass, the cow, the whatever, and they make a god to all of these things. And Paul's saying, okay, now I can't acknowledge that you are following the truth, but I can acknowledge that you're making an effort. And so that's where he's going to start. I acknowledge that you're making a pursuit of something bigger than yourself. I acknowledge, number two, that you're taking extreme efforts. That's pretty extreme if you think about it. We might have forgotten a God. And so let's make this altar and it's a kind of the catch-all altar, just in case we forgot somebody. That's pretty extreme, but they're making that kind of effort. However, it's the third point that really is the one you and I identify with the most. And you've heard, again, many sermons on this, and so I'm not going to belabor the point too awful much, except to say that I think that in our discussion of convincing others to change, this third point, as Paul builds toward it, this third point is really, really practical, much like last week. It's something you can put to work today in your life. And so he acknowledges their pursuit, he acknowledges the extreme efforts that they're making to get the pursuit done, but then number three, he acknowledges the common footing that they have. Now, this is where Paul really turns the corner. He's gone now from being somebody who's trying to win friends to somebody who's trying to make application. And so he says in verse 23 and following, "For I passed along, observed the objects of your worship, and found the altar with the inscription of the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." Verse 24, "The God who made the world and everything in it," etc. And he's going to go on to talk about God is not not worshipped by temples made with hands, and making reference to the fact that y'all have gone so far as to build all these altars with all of your effort, trying to attract attention to these various gods, when God, the one God, the only God, really doesn't need all that stuff. What he needs is your heart. And so Paul, as he turns the corner at this third point in our lesson today, he stops being an acknowledger of their pursuit, the extreme efforts of their pursuit, and he starts being a person who acknowledges the proper application. Now, I acknowledge that you folks are seeking something bigger than yourself. I acknowledge that you've gone out of your way to make sure that you have all these altars, including one just in case you missed one. I acknowledge all of that. But here's the point, my friends. You've got to realize that all of what you have done here is worthless because you're missing the one altar that really is appropriate, and yet you've called it the unknown God. We know this one, we know that one, we don't know this one. So just in case, we'll throw him some extra time, just in case we might have missed him. And Paul says, that's the one that trumps all of the others that you have tried to acknowledge. Now, that's not a statement that is designed to win friends. I'm not saying that Paul went into the Areopagus with the desire to win enemies, but I need you to recognize that what Paul does here is that he bends over backwards, jumps through hoops, if you will, to get to a point where he can say, now what you're going to do with it. I've tried to be positive. I acknowledge you've got a good pursuit here, something bigger than yourself. I've tried to be positive. I acknowledge that you've gone to extreme efforts to make sure that your pursuit is successful. I've done everything I could to find some good in this situation. But now, number 3, guys, it's time to make some choices. And so it's a rather short but really interesting sermon that Paul is going to present here. And he starts right off in verse 24 by saying, the God. Not the gods, plural, the God. The God who made the world and everything in it. Now hold on. So you're telling me there is a singular God, monotheism. There's one God who's responsible for everything? Then what does that do to the altar that we have to the sun and to the moon and to the stars? It eliminates its priority. It eliminates its need. Because I'm going to tell you about the one God who made all of the stuff that you're trying to acknowledge with all of your various altars. I want to tell you about the one God. Possibly the most tragic part of this sermon is that Paul has to acknowledge, there's our word again, acknowledge how they acknowledged the one true God. They didn't have a name. They really didn't have any details. They didn't have much faith. They certainly didn't give the one true God all the glory that he deserved by acknowledging the one true God as being the only God. They didn't do that. Paul has to acknowledge that they are acknowledging the one true God as almost a second-hand cast-off, just in case, altar to a maybe God. How tragic is that? A maybe God, a just in case God. And so as he comes to the conclusion of his lesson, Paul doesn't stop with a compromised, I want to try to brag on you people for having a good pursuit and making extra effort. He doesn't stop there. He stops with, okay, folks, I've done my best to be friendly up front, but now we got to make some application. And the application is this: you missed it. And you missed it bad. The one true God who is responsible for everything, and you shoved him aside, given him a leftover altar. I want to tell you about that God. Now, before I end, I want to rush you back again to our climactic part of the passage. And I want you again to see the 3 groups that come from a rather powerful message. But remember, we're in the epicenter of idolatry. And so what's the results of Paul's 3 points? Trying to brag on their pursuits, their efforts, and then turning the corner and saying, okay, now what's our common ground? The common ground is there is a one God system, and y'all, even though you've made a little bit of an effort with this leftover altar over here, you've tried. I want to tell you about that one. Now repent, come to that one. What's the results? Well, again, you go back and you notice that number 1, he's going to get mocked. Number 2, he's going to have some interest. That's curious. I like that. I don't mind yeah, you can come back next time. And then number 3, he'll have some who are really dedicated to what has taken place. Only a few, it sounds like, but they actually believed. The same thing is going to happen to you as you present Paul's strategy to individuals you're trying to convince to come to the truth. Many of them are just going to dismiss you outright. And once you've left their presence, they'll probably make fun of you. They'll probably mock you. They'll probably gossip about you. They'll probably tell their closest friends, you're not going to believe what that guy said. There'll be others who will be curious. Those values are interesting. I can see how that might work. I don't mind talking to you again. But they're not going to have any real level of desire to change. And then there's the third group. And it's not unlike what Jesus says, few there be that find it. The third group is always much smaller. And the reason is because the third group requires change. It requires effort, sacrifice. And people don't like that. We want to be comfortable. I don't want somebody to say that I've spent the majority of my life pursuing that which is false. And so we resist it. We push against it. And we are typically part of the first two groups. Most of us will mock. Some of us will be curious, but we're not really interested in going that direction. And then just a few. And so my question for you, really, before you try to apply these 3 points of Paul in the community, my question for you is, are you willing to be in that third group? Christianity was not designed to present a comfort zone in which you can live. We often think of it as that way. You become a Christian, you're going to have this fellowship of friends and family, and that is going to make up for all the pressures of the world. And it doesn't. It still hurts. It hurts bad. The rejection is real. Now, does it make up for it in the sense that one day I'll go to a place where perfect peace will come? Certainly. But that's future. That's yet to come. See, the problem with the church is, if we were to stay within our little bubble that we like to claim every Sunday morning, and that's the only place we lived, the world would have no hope. The problem with the church is that we are called to not exist within this little comfort zone throughout the week. Our problem is we've got to go out there and experience them and be a part of their context. And that hurts. And so when I say the problem of the church, I'm not saying that the church has an error. I'm saying that the church has a problem. The problem is, how do we take that which is pure, that which is wholesome, that which is peaceful, and bring it into a dark world of tragedy and hurt and hopelessness? How do we do that without allowing that context to impact us? You can't. If you can't hurt for those who are hurting, you don't deserve to be in the bubble, ever. And so the difficulty that the church faces is the desire to live within our bubble, but the responsibility to go outside the bubble in order to bring people into our bubble. One of the things that I've always struggled with our fellowship is that we tend to use going to church as our biggest evangelistic tool, which is tragic. If you think about it, going to worship is our big evangelist. How is that even possible? Because those who are outside the Lord, they don't even know how to worship. This is our time. This is our place. To use my word, this is our bubble, and it's okay. And Hebrews 10, 24 and 25, we should not forsake it because we need it. But in the process of that, we've got to recognize that to go outside our comfort zone to the world is the only way that we're going to be able to introduce them to what is true within the bubble that we exist. So, and I'll end with this idea. I've been thinking about this a lot this past week. Church growth, meaning numbers, is actually a byproduct of our time together in worship. Meaning that we don't come to worship as an evangelistic tool. We come to worship, read Hebrews 10, 24 and 25, to encourage one another in our bubble. Now, the more I'm encouraged, the more strength I feel to go out into the world. And being strong in the world because of the bubble time that I've had with you allows me to effectively share my faith with individuals in the world. And some of those, not many, but some of those will say, I want to know about your bubble. I want to visit your bubble. And in that, there will be church growth. But I think sometimes we've had it upside down. We come together to win souls. No. We come together to strengthen the souls that are here. And then we leave the bubble to win souls and attract those souls to our little bubble. I don't know if that makes any sense to you or not, but I've really prayed and thought about that this week, because I feel like that sometimes with regards to church growth, we have it upside down. This is our time. Thrilled to have visitors, thankful that they come to be with us. All of that is true, but this is our time. If they see something that they relate to and they want to be a part of, God bless them. Let's do everything that we can to strengthen them, to bring them here, and all the, to keep them here. That's very important. But we're going to meet the world out there. And so when we go out there, we need to acknowledge that they are pursuing something. Some of them making extreme efforts to get there. But always turn the corner in that conversation to, but are you really pursuing what is best? The one true God. Stop living your life with altars to an unknown God, and start living your life by coming to the one true Jesus Christ, the God, who not only created this place, but keeps it together. That's the invitation that we have for them.